Then we can, okay, so welcome to good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time of day you're at now. Welcome to the new season of ENSO seminars. We took a slightly longer summer hiatus than originally planned, and we are delighted to be able to kick off the 2017-2018 academic year. We will have, I'm going to give, because of the YouTube live format, I'm going to give people just a few minutes to log on to allow us to pick up a few streamers, and we have one or two other individuals who might join us for the live discussion. If you're watching live now and would like a link to join the discussion live later on for the Q&A session after Miriam's talk, then send me an email. It's marek.mcgann, marek.mcgann, marek.mcgann@gmail.com, and I can send you out the live link. That's only if you're watching this live, obviously. If you're watching the recording, it's way too late for any of that, and you can just sit back and relax and watch how things unfold from this point on. So our speaker this month is Dr. Miriam Kyselo. Miriam is a postdoctoral researcher at the Technical University of Berlin. Miriam completed her doctorate in the University of Osnabrück in the School of Cognitive Science. Has completed postdoctoral work both at the University of the Basque Country in San Sebastian and at the University of Amsterdam.
And the Technical University.
And also the technical, well, you're ongoing in the Technical University.
Yes, that's true too. Yeah.
So the title of Miriam's talk this month will be the diversity in the diversity on the minimal self, and we'll give people maybe 1 minute or two longer to join in. We have a few viewers, and we'll give people just another minute or two before we kick off with the actual talk. But it's kind of interesting to see. Always interesting to see that there's been this gradual coalescing of the different strands of enactivism, but they haven't quite come together yet. We have the sort of the sensorimotor aspect of it, and the social participatory sense-making and self and
yes,
interactivity aspect of it, and they're gradually coming together over these last few years, but they still work to do, I think.
Yeah, that's correct. That's probably true, I think, of the field. I mean, not just in enactivism, I think.
That is
in general. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we've sort of paused or allowed enough time to lapse. Others may still come on stream as we continue, but for the moment, I think we are ready to go. So I think, Miriam, I can invite you to share your slides.
Yeah, the screen, yeah.
You can,
we'll take this one, and I'm just going to hit the play button right away. Yeah, can you see the slides?
You can see the slides clearly, yes.
Wonderful. Okay. Oh, there was a green little light that I was kind of like focusing on. Now it's gone, but that was kind of my connection to you guys out there. Well, thanks a lot, Marek, for inviting me. It's a very exciting opportunity. I'm not seeing anyone, not hearing anyone.
We're all still here.
Yes,
we are.
Yeah. Great to know. Okay. So you already said I'm going to speak about the diversity and the minimal self. We could also say diversity in the minimal self. Looking at the minimal self from an active viewpoint. So currently, we are living in what Barresi and Martin have called an era of fragmentation when it comes to the study of the self. So there's very many notions. I mean, that's always been the case, but still today you can see there's like a little display, the cognitive self, the minimal self, the social self, the situated self, and extended self. The self is not just a subject to philosophers any longer. It's studied by psychologists, people in robotics, artificial intelligence. So there's a huge fragmentation. It's not so clear actually how all of them interrelate. So at the moment, it seems in our field that there is an emphasis on two notions, however, the minimal self and the social and narrative self. And yeah, that distinction has been made or like suggested by Gallagher in a 2000 paper. And the two of them are, so the minimal self refers to the bodily self. It's seen as something like the most primitive sense in which we would speak of a self. And then there's the social extended self, having a coherent self-image, bringing together our past and our future. At the moment, it seems that these two notions are treated as pretty separate, and there's also a hierarchy in that we first need to have a minimal self, a bodily self, and then from there we can develop a narrative or extended social self. So in this talk, the focus is going to be on the minimal self, but there will be a relation to the social self, because I'm wondering to which extent that kind of distinction is actually makes sense. So I will first introduce the minimal self, then I will challenge it, making the point that it's essentially individualistic. We will look a little bit into an alternative construction from an experiential point of view, and then finally also from an ontological point of view by considering an alternative view of the self from an active point of view. I think the title was pretty ambitious. Let's see how far we get with that. So what's the minimal self? As I said, it's usually distinguished from the narrative self. It's a phenomenological concept, first and foremost. Some proponents coming to mind are Husserl, based on Husserl, Husserl's conception of subjectivity, and then nowadays we have Zahavi and Gallagher who are making sense or using that notion. So the minimal self refers to the phenomenal character of being a self. It's the basic feel of being a self, and it is also referred to as a pre-reflective bodily self-awareness. And as I indicated, currently we have like two people that have been writing on that. There's Jean Gallagher and then Zahavi. And Jean Gallagher suggested that we distinguish with regards to the minimal self between the sense of agency and the sense of ownership. Sense of ownership means that I am experiencing myself as the initiator of my own action. So when I grasp a cup, it's me, it's my body in which the grasping action originates, and the sense of ownership means that the action that I carry out is currently mine. So I grasp the cup. So even if someone moves my arm, it's still my action when I'm grasping the cup. And related to that sense of ownership is what then Zahavi calls the sense of mineness associated with the minimal self. And this is what I would like to focus on. So what is mineness? Mineness is focusing on the experience of the self in the here and now. Again, it's not extended, it's not through time. And it focuses not so much on the content of the experience, on the what, but on the how. How is it given? We also speak of a first person givenness. How is an experience given to me? Well, it is given to me. It is the minimal self, and that sense of mineness is a feature of every experience we have. So here's an example. Imagine you're like in Norway sitting in a kayak, and you see from this perspective, you can see the water, the reflection of the nature, and all of that is like given to you from your own unique first personal viewpoint, if you will. So that's kind of a visual, egocentric viewpoint. Another one is like maybe more tactile. So imagine you kind of like in the morning waking up, putting water into your face, the feel of the water is kind of like, is given to you as it's like your hands, it's like your, the liquidiness of the water is like given to you in a specific first personal way. And then Zahavi is introducing a thought experiment to kind of like hammer this idea, like in, and he suggests to imagine two psychological and physiological identical twins, Mick and Mack, and they're currently looking at the white wall. So when they are, because they are like identical, the content of their experience is pretty much the same. They both see a white wall. So from an outside or third person perspective, we're not able to distinguish the experience. But if we now adopt the perspective of either one of them, say we are Mick or Mack, then suddenly we notice a difference. Because when we were like imagining we are Mick, turns out there is actually, oops, sorry for that, again, the wideness of the wall is like given to me. It's given to me in my own, personal way. So what's interesting is that so I was saying in the beginning, the minimal self is a phenomenological concept, but at the same time, and that speaks a little bit against what I said also about the fragmentation, there is a movement, I think, nowadays in cognitive science to conceive of the self in terms of the body. So there's actually a counterpart of the phenomenological minimal self at the ontological level, and that has been dubbed, we can call it the essential embodiment thesis of the self, is Maiese who coined that. Is the idea that phenomenological minimal self that we just discussed is basically grounded in the physiological structures, in the structures of the sensorimotor organism. And qua having that grounding in the organism, we got this like egocentric structure, this like outlook that we had. And there's other aspects that we will not go into now. But important is that the minimal self is a property of the organism. And for that reason, it can also be present in animals, all sorts of animals, living beings, and also in children. The problem with that is that there is a problem, going to that if we conceive of selfhood in terms of this like separating mineness, then it's also a pretty individualistic notion of the self. So Barresi and Martin have put it was not with respect to the minimal self, but more generally with like notions of like Western notions of the self is we conceive of the self as a source of unity, power, freedom, control, and persistence. But the question is, what about the social? As I indicated, there is the implication in the minimal self is that it is independent of others and of sociality. So we first are a minimal self qua our organismic body, then we can engage with others. So it's actually a prerequisite that we have a minimal self. We make a distinction from others. And Zahavi also says that the minimal self is that what distinguishes us from other experiential lives. And the idea is basically that we have this like body that has, limitations at the skin, and this is how we distinguish ourselves from other bodies. The problem with that is that at the same time, even though we say that there is like nothing intrinsically social to the minimal self, there is some sort of like, relationality at place when we make that claim. We also saw it in the example of Mick and Mack. In order to make sense of first person givenness, we needed to posit two subjects. So the question is, can we really say that the minimal self is distinct from the social self or the social realm? And we must not assume, already a very reflexive version or linguistic version of this the social self. There could be, more pre-reflective variants. So I think we could raise three objections to that idea of the minimal self, grounded in the sensorimotor organism. The first would be phenomenological. The question, is that really the case that our sense of self is best described in terms of separating mineness? And I'm really putting emphasis on separation because that seems to be kind of the essential feature of the minimal self. And then we can ask ontologically, as it's really nice now that we have, so to say, with the body, some sort of common ground in philosophy and cognitive science. We can all relate to the same object of study. But the question is that really, is that justified, that hope? Is the self equal to the sensorimotor organism? And then finally, a developmental question: is the minimal self actually really given from birth, or is it rather something developed? And in this, in my talk here, I'm focusing mainly on the phenomenological and ontological, even though developmental, we will see this. Yeah, we won't see that, I think, in this talk, but it's obviously very important here. Yeah. So let's consider. Let's have a look. Let's come back to the experiences of being in the world. It's not a secret. There's obviously alternative, suggestions. I'm thinking of Dreyfus's notion of absorbed coping, that our engagement with the world entails some sort of sense of immersion. There's not a sensed separation, but rather a pre-reflective coping with the world. We're like immersed with it. We have like here two examples, like dancing tango or playing the piano is more. There's not really an egocentric structure, but more a feeling of like we're like merging with the other, or even merging with an instrument. We kind of like don't center ourselves in the body, but like rather in the interaction, or into the flow with the instrument that we're currently playing. So it seems, phenomenologically speaking, there's at least that other dimension of openness and immersion. And indeed, if we look into other cultures, so I mean, the minimal self is like Husserl, Zahavi, these are like Western philosophers, if you will. But there's other cultures in which we have like very different, views of what selfhood consists of. So, for instance, there's cultures in East Pacific, such as the Maoris and the Kubaru, where the self actually includes others. So a tribal chief may say I, but by that he actually refers to his entire tribe. So he is a social collective, and others are participating in this person. It's also reflected by research in cultural psychology, showing that there's two different schemas. In Asian cultures, for instance, or Eastern cultures, there's more like an interdependent self-schema, emphasizing connection to others, participation, immersion, altruism, and then there's a more independent schema, which is emphasizing control, power, egocentricity. So it seems we should probably take these other phenomenological descriptions and conception of self into consideration, and just assume that somehow both seem to be the case. It's not just that our self is about mineness, is also about being connected with others. So from an experiential viewpoint, it seems fair to say that there's also some sort of social or open dimension. Now the question is, what about the ontological level? So thus far we have said that the minimal self is like grounded in the organism, and that kind of gives, I think, support to that intuition that the boundaries are kind of given through the body. What I think is, from an enactive viewpoint, I think we have an alternative view on that. So there have been a bunch of talks on what the enactive approach entails. I think the last talk by Ezekiel was on Sensorimotor Agency, so I'm not going to repeat all of that here. But perhaps just these points that, from an enactive point of view, minds, agents are not seen as like static islands, and the body is not some sort of individualistic like token, or it's a network of activity. And what I think is important here, what I would like to emphasize, is that from an active point of view, we don't make like there's not a clear ontological cut between there's the agent and there's the world, but there's a more an organizational distinction. And so what makes an agent has to do with the kind of activities, with kind of engagements, she's engaged with, hence the term enactive. So our identities, our bodies are enacted through using them and relating them. And the important idea is here, so that there's actually a relation, an openness to the world. And it's just that I think you've seen that picture before, that is Ezekiel who made it. It just shows again that there is not this like clear-cut split, but that it depends on the relation, of certain processes to each other, that we can say something is distinct from something else. So it seems, as Evan Thompson says, that on such a view, the self is not so much a static thing, a moment in time. It's rather a process, and he has called it a process of eyeing, a process that enacts an eye, where the eye is no different from the eyeing process itself. He compares it to a dance. And then if we then think about if the self is not a thing, if it's not like limited to the body but rather processual, then maybe it makes sense to have also a more open understanding at the phenomenological level. So here, feminist thinker Maimonides, for instance, rejects this notion of the body as something distinct, and she says, instead of thinking of the body as something individualistic, we should think of it as like watery and oceanic. That reminds us also of Mead, I think, who was speaking about a similar idea. And she says, we are like, I'm a singular dynamic world solving a complex fluid circulation. So the idea would be to conceive of selves as processes, and obviously as like bodily processes, but there are different levels, and here we have like 3 of them, as Thompson and Varela have suggested. And as you said, Marek, in the introduction, I don't know if we were on air yet, but there is some sort of like still a gap between bringing together like the second and the third loop, the sensorimotor interactions and the intersubjective loops that we have with the world. And I think if we consider the fact, like from a phenomenological perspective, that we are indeed, connected to others, that we are, then again, from an ontological perspective, like living in a world of others, then these processes are leaking out into, into the realm of others as well. So we are not just bodies in separation, we are bodies in interaction, we merge with others. So the idea would be that our default state of being, instead of like assuming like mineness and that separation, is actually quite the opposite. It's that we're being one. What Merleau-Ponty speaks of a syncretic sociability, a state of free communication. So we form an anonymous collectivity, an undifferentiated group life. And from such a view, there arises the question, so how can we differentiate ourselves from this syncretic sociability? How can we act as an individual self and still be connected to others? And I think that's the suggestion. And now it's going to be really quick. I already also see we're like running out of time. But this would be the idea is that now from an enactive viewpoint, that question is basically kind of the motor of the minimal self. So we are bringing together these dimensions. We are seeking to avoid an individualistic stance. At the same time, we are seeking to avoid, obviously, to just, immerse with the world and kind of lose ourselves. We are trying to negotiate this tension between them. So from an enactive viewpoint and taking into consideration that we are relational beings, the minimal self might be an active process and also an interactive process. And so I suggest in my work that we conceive of it as an autonomous system, but it's a relational, a social autonomous system. And by that, I don't refer to the group, but I refer to individual agents. So it would be possessing a minimal self is when we're able not just to, sense that this or that experience is mine, but that I also can, deliberately kind of change between understanding that this experience is mine, and here I am connected and open to somebody else or something else. So it's actually involving some sort of like ability to negotiate the relations to others. It's like reflecting, this idea is reflecting a little bit, that's leads too far, I guess, but like Goethe's 2 souls that are in our chest, and we'd like to connect to others, delve into the world, but at the same time, there's also some sort of movement of emancipation. And that together basically leads us to what he calls here a new and varied life. So, yeah, our goals, on the one hand, we try to avoid immersion, and that, the proponents of the minimal self are quite correct. We do not want to claim that selfhood is just immersion. But at the same time, we can also not, we should not reside with the idea that minimal selfhood is essentially about separating mineness, because this would kind of like risk, adopting a view of an individualistic viewpoint. So to conclude, basically, if we would, from an enactive viewpoint, it seems we could allow for kind of more diverse understanding of subjectivity, in a sense that there's maybe degrees of mineness and of immersion, and kind of moving along a scale between these like real extreme poles. And we may also in that way account for something that like happens outside our own, in German you say Tellerrand, the rim of the plate, our own cultural background, and account for culture differences, for conceptions of the self that are, that don't emphasize, that distinction so much, but that emphasize a more connecting and participatory dimension. And yeah, I mean, even for, the very same person, we change, even on a daily basis. You're not all the time, in a mode of separation from others. You're also feeling connected to them. So I guess the one of the basic research questions from such a view would be: so how do we differentiate ourselves? How do we develop from that kind of syncretic sociability into a being that's able to kind of achieve a balance? And then just some guidelines, I think, and then I'm going to stop and I give the opportunity for discussion. But some implications would be, we would look at the minimal self as something that is dynamic, as a processual phenomenon, opening up to questions of the development of the self, rather than just describing it from the viewpoint of an already matured person. And it would seem that we have to study even minimal selfhood in relation to sociality. There's no such thing, I would argue, from an enactive viewpoint, as a minimal self that is not at the same time a social self. And given that this is kind of an endeavor that we do together with others, we would have to assume that there's also place for unpredictability, surprise, and error. Because that kind of like allows us to, for others to exist in their own right, and for ourselves to exist in our own right. And last but not least, we might acknowledge that there's also tension, struggle, and conflict, which, and that's just one of the implications, would, perhaps kind of give us a different perspective on how we conceive of disorders of the self. Yeah, what's happening when things are going wrong? I'm thinking there of schizophrenia, where the common symptoms are like a loss of self and a kind of a feeling of isolation. It might be that when we adopt an enactive perspective on the minimal self as something processual that kind of tries to negotiate these dimensions, that symptoms as such can be made sense of in a better way. And with that, I think I'm through. Mr. Thank you slide.
That's great.
And let me now get out of this. Sharing the screen. Do you see? No, you don't see me. You see my screen. Here, there.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Miriam. Thanks for that. There's sort of a richness of material there. So for those of you who are watching live, there are two ways that you might sort of identify or sort of introduce a question. So through the live chat on the YouTube live page, the event page that you're looking at, you'll be able to ask a question there, and I can introduce it so that it's included here, and Miriam can respond to it. Alternatively, you can email me at marek.mcgann@gmail.com, and if I receive any emails while the discussion is going on, I'll, as I said, introduce the question to the discussion. Over time as well, the whole process of an entails seminar is an unfolding event, which continues past the official live chat. So there is a forum on Miriam's event page on the SL Seminars webpage, and you'll be able to potentially discuss things there. But I suppose to get things started, Miriam, there's a whole bunch of things that I'd love to go into in more detail. But I guess one of the things that I'm particularly curious about is that relationship between the minimal self and the richer narrative self, and the way your discussion unfolded. The minimal self got very got deeply folded into the ongoing narrative self through its socialization, I suppose. The fact, once the minimal self is socialized, the distinction between it and this separate narrative self starts to blur a little bit, I think. And I guess I'm particularly curious about the way in which that might mean that our minimal selves, which is supposedly just this, or at least the way it's sometimes described as this biological, the really sort of core bounded thing, is transformed by others, where that the body that I have is shaped by the interactions that I have with other human beings, and that sort of developmental story. So is that, how radical is the claim that you'd like to make on there? How deep do you want to go with that? Does this distinction between the minimal self and the social narrative self hold up? Is there something still there about it, or do we really need to overhaul it completely?
Yeah, so I think yes and no. I think when we distinguish only between the minimal self, like the bodily self, and then the social self, and the social self is that narrative self, is that already like, reflexive self, linguistic self, then we're kind of like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because there is this social engagement that we have that is like pre-reflexive, bodily, direct, through touch, through gestures, things like that. So I guess we should we should at least broaden the notion of what we mean by the self when we oppose it by the social self, and allow for that kind of pre-reflective social dimension. Then things would look, I think, look a little bit different, and there wouldn't be such a clear-cut distinction anymore. And to the second thing that you said, you said a couple of things, but what I kind of like focus on the question of how radical I would like that claim to be then. Yes, so I think once we are kind of allowing for the idea that there's this kind of like pre-reflective sociality, then it's kind of like it's a task, it's like I think our default mode is really we are continuously attuned to others. We are like one. So it's a task, like being a self is a continuous achievement. So, and it happens, so it's kind of like it's a, it's the process of differentiation from that direct attunement that we have. And we continuously, and that's kind of at the same time a motor of life, I think, because we risk, like falling back into it, because that's kind of the mode. That's what we like doing, just like be there with others, or be there, even just watching TV or doing other things. This is a great need, to just be connected to the world. So it's actually a difficult thing, not the most natural thing, I think, to develop a self. But yes, in order to do so, we need to kind of like work our way through this kind of like direct attunement and connection that we have. And then ideally doing it in a way that we're not ending up at the other, side of things as isolated. And I think there's a little bit of a tendency when we speak about the self to focus on once it's already, like perfectly distinguished from that dimension. So yes, I agree that our bodies are, so it's not, the idea is not to argue that the self is not embodied. Quite to the contrary, it is always also embodied, but it's not that the self resides in the body and is like kind of like equal to it. It's kind of more like coincidental. It's like pretty Aristotelian in that sense. So I would conceive of the body as something transformative indeed, and it will depend on like the kind of like culture we grow up, the kind of like social relations we have, what kind of what kind of self we are developing and how the body is like mediating that. But it's not just the body; it's also like the technology. Right now what we're doing now is like using tools to enable these processes. And it's not so clear that the self is just within in that in that case, in that fleshy case here. It leaks out, and then there's obviously some sort of relationality to the extended mind idea, but more so, I think it will leak out into the sphere of others, with others. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just some of the ways in which you were describing things there, it really struck me, and it links to the notion of tension that you introduced as well. That as you called it, the motor of the self, and the motor of cognition, really. It's almost like the way you described it there is the self is almost appetitive. It's like an appetite that we have, the social self, and this desire we have both to distinguish ourselves and to immerse ourselves kind of comes in rhythms, in much the same way that hunger or thirst might, that we might have. Well, I haven't eaten in a while. I'm really hungry now, so I'm going to eat. But then after I've stuffed myself, I just can't. I don't want any more food for a while now. So I can, and it might be that our sense of self as individual and conjoined and so on, it sort of operates in similar rhythmic notions, and possibly produced by the same kinds of tensions that. In the way that the use of resources by the body produces hunger, but then satiety can sort of momentarily at least release that tension. But there's something about the way we live as human beings begins to reintroduce that tension again.
Yeah, I agree. I mean that is very much in line what we from an Enactive viewpoint would claim, that cognition and mind is not. Is purpose driven. It has a concern. So and yes, at the level of organisms, we're looking at metabolic needs, but then as we're considering these high levels of agency, we're looking at social needs, at needs such as recognition. It's like social nutrition, if you will. So in that sense, there's a rhythm in the same way that I need to eat. I need to also, every now and then feed on on being with others, on being seen, on relating to them. And I mean, there's pretty, dramatic cases that kind of support that idea. If you think of just solitary confinement, there's this great book by Lisa Günther on solitary confinement, and not just her, but also others. They have shown that. If when inmates are prolonged, in solitary confinement, they develop serious psychiatric symptoms, hallucinations. They stop being able to distinguish between is that my body, is that my experience, or is it somebody else's? So if you think of the minimal self as something that's in the body, then you would actually expect these people to be okay. I mean, so there are also, there's restriction at the body level, obviously, because they can't move around and stuff, but you would think more or less, the ability to distinguish their experiences, at least from those of others, that must be given. But it turns out not. And, we can hypothesize, and Günther does so as well, that the self, if it's something, if it's a social structure, then that makes sense that we see these symptoms. Simply because, these inmates are kind of deprived of basic nutrition, social nutrition, being able to relate to others. Yeah, so, I guess the rhythm picture makes sense, yeah.
Okay. So I'm just having a sort of a quick check of comments and email there. And Adrian, if you have any questions or queries, if you want to hop in, please do.
Yes, I will. I'm kind of letting things sink in a bit, and I will in a second.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
You like three little lights when you speak. So.
So one thing I did want to check, now this is something of a more specific question, so I'm going to have to try and reproduce the context a little bit, which you were discussing, I think, the notion of the syncretic sociality. But at one point you were discussing the self as both an active process and an interactive process. And this is just a phrase you used, so this might be a slightly mean question to try and remember a very particular phrase.
We're talking about recognition, and you're asking me a mean question.
Yeah. So, but you specifically said in terms of sociality, you didn't want to refer to the group, but to individual agents. Can you say say a little bit more about what precisely you meant there?
Okay, yeah, this is a tricky question. So I mean, some of the work, and I think Hanne's talk was going into that in detail. In Enactive cognition is the idea that you can apply this notion of autonomy also to describe group identities. So, and I would just like to avoid that. So we can actually speak about relationality as the core of agency with regards to individual agents and with regards to group agents, if you will. And I think both are obviously intertwined, because you could always say at some point when you are merging, merging is maybe the wrong word, but when you're like open and connecting with someone, because I think that's essential. You're not really merging with the other, you're connecting to them. There might be a way in which you could describe that part as some sort of like group. And then in that sense, you could speak of some sort of, social agency involving several individuals, but that's fleeting. I mean, that's like, we kind of continuously integrate the movement away from these engagements as well. So, I guess the idea of need for freedom, Jonas, comes to mind there. So we are kind of connected to the sphere of otherness, and in that sense, you can speak of some sort of like a group identity, but we never fully kind of coincide with that. Yeah, we kind of move away, and this kind of like a trickiness, because I would say we're always related. But we're just not related to the same person or the same kind of people all the time, yeah? And so this kind of movement, emancipatory movement, if you will, that's kind of like important here, because otherwise you will end up, at a new level of description, at a new systemic level, where you're looking at a group identity, where indeed, the individual agency is kind of like dissolving into a greater, purpose, and then when you then look from that regard, from that perspective onto the individual agents, you would have like more heterogeneous norms. But I guess, I mean, in part that's also what we experience. We are not always in control of ourselves. So the things that Hanne and Ezekiel argue in their approach to participative sense making is holds true. Is like selfhood is about being in control and trying to be in control, but it is also about, giving in and not being able to do, much when others, for instance, don't want to, or have like you're in, relations of power or so where, you don't have the means, to emancipate yourself from that structure. But that's exactly the struggle, and I think there needs to be work done in active cognition to kind of like spell out how these different levels of social agency are related, let alone sensorimotor and social agency are related. Yeah. Okay,
so something that I think actually works slightly as a follow-up to that question is Luis Espinosa has posted a question on the live chat, which is, I think, just a clarification question then. So in the terms that you're describing, is the self then a continuous autopoietic process of merging and differentiating oneself from others? So I get one of the things I'm curious there, just in the way that the question's been worded, is does the self have to be autopoietic, or is the process a little bit more open than that?
Yeah.
This is something. Can I just quickly also?
Sure.
Because I think, yeah, I mean, schizophrenia again would present itself as a very, very difficult case, I think, because you have this. I mean, to what extent could this self actually be, you know, kind of still circular, you know, in terms of really, yeah, I mean, as an autopoietic kind of constant. So you have relationality, but you have also this multi-layered kind of, you know, disruptions in, you know, if you say, okay, affectivity, you have the so-called positive symptoms, right? You have hallucinations, you have, etc. So it seems as if, well, yeah, as you well know, this is something I've been also kind of trying to engage with in my own work, in my own thesis, and there seem to be kind of maybe different. How could I put this?
You want to like specify the kind of like how we like levels of relationality or levels of
exactly of kind of possible relationality, right? In this case, because it would be something that is kind of contextually somehow dependent again.
Yeah.
On how severely that person might be affected or not, and
yeah. So I mean, I can maybe try perhaps to to maybe first respond to Marek, and then your implicit, I don't know what I take to be a comment or a question or kind of So I think that's the challenge to the enactive approach, I think here, Marek, in that so we operate with this notion of, you know, self-organization, and we like to distinguish between autonomy and you know, or autonomous system and heteronomous systems. And it sometimes somehow seems that when we speak about the self, that kind of resists that kind of that distinction. I mean, I think we're bringing together like very different levels, and that's kind of the problem here, because you may very well, I think, describe from a relational social perspective. I think there's not really a contradiction. You just conceive of that of this autonomous system as a self-other constituted system. So the processes are just relational processes, and the precariousness or the organizational closure is achieved through linking, you know, kind of like tendencies to open up and close. But I guess, yes, it would you know, contradict the original idea of autopoiesis to some degree. I guess it's more like a self-other organization that we have here. And then with regards to what you said, Adrian, so what I take you to be saying is that you would like to distinguish perhaps between like different levels of how this is achieved, and that so there could be also variation.
Exactly, or not, because it might really depend whether there is this kind of how can you say this? Well, the contact with others per se, right? Because you have patients that are just kind of, if you take hallucinations or whatever, this is something that is, well, happening. Well, no, go ahead. Continue
just
your line of.
Just because I know a little bit, I think what you're getting at. So I just so you mean to say that perhaps, you know, this kind of like self-maintenance in negotiation with others is something that we see at different levels in disorders, for instance. So
exactly, yeah.
That would be another place where we should look into. So some people, some might, like they might be like effectively, they might have like, an effect, are still there emotionally, but it's not, taking to be something relational, or I don't know what others have, like, language restrictions. And so what I take you to be targeting is that there's, different ways in which this like relationality or kind of self
could or not happen. Exactly. I mean, could or not be here.
Yeah. It's, I don't know if the audience will understand that at all, because it's a little bit implicit. But yeah, Adrian is working on schizophrenia. He's trying to
well, I guess to me, I mean, just as an external sort of perspective on that particular conversation, what's partly seems to be getting at is the question of how many selves per organism, right? So if with a base level conception of the minimal self, the self as biological organism, then it's very easy one-to-one, right? So for every organism that's interacting with its environment, you only get one minimal self, and that's it. If you open up the notion that the minimal self can actually be, because of the processes, is transformed over the course of its lifetime, then you also have the possibility of contextualized minimal selves, because there's going to be skill development involved, and there might be multiple forms of skill being deployed in any one situation. We might be good at some skills and not so good at others, and insofar as there is any potential for differentiation there, you have the potential for self-dissonance, right? So I might be very capable on some levels, but a very incapable, levels is the wrong word. So I might be capable of skilled interaction through one means, but less capable through another means. I might nevertheless be in contact with the environment in all of those manners simultaneously. And if you have a sort of separation of capacity there, then you potentially run into precisely the kinds of differentiations that you've been talking about.
There was a
glitch.
A glitch. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that that makes sense. So you have that. That's what I kind of try to like hint at, that we get like a more kind of like more diversity, so to say, because the world is diverse, and so if the self is not just the body, then we allow for several ways of like this kind of like, I mean, yes, okay, skilled intentional actions. That's the example you gave, but like I guess different ways in which we are structuring our social existence. They might inform or kind of like support or constitute even a particular give it a particular shape. So I would think of it's kind of like more the minimal self as some sort of like profile that can change over time, and I think that makes this kind of like more process-oriented view, I think seems to capture the more diverse phenomenology of subjectivity that we have, available, I think.
So it's not diversity across individuals, but within
across individuals, across even the same individual, and then at the level of when we're thinking about what kind of mechanisms constitute a self, even at the level of is this, can we account for technology, language, tools that are not organismic.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw in a related point here, and this is from Andrea Jelic via the website as well. So she indicates or suggests that a useful playground for discussing these issues might actually be extraordinary experiences in. She mentions architecture specifically, but I wonder if there might also be a general consideration about art that's relevant. That the sort of experience of being in a place and immersed, and I suppose there's a psychologist I worked with. I studied with for a while, Kieran Benson, who talks about the absorbed self in aesthetic experience, and I think maybe Andrea is talking about the same kind of thing in architecture, where you just become caught up in or immersed in the experience of being in a given place or interacting with a given piece of art.
Yeah, I guess I mean I mean, from my own experience, I mean, like when I go to museum and specifically like look at contemporary art or so, like I do experience some sort of like relaxation where I see that, I connect to it, I'm kind of like immersed in it, and it gives, you know, it, and it's at the same time very like, you know, private. It has to do like with me. It's kind of some sort of intimacy between me and the artwork, but at the same time, kind of like a clear openness. I guess I haven't explicitly thought about the relation between the minimal self and art, but I think in as much as if we would allow, you know, bodies are open processes, then obviously this might be, you know, there can be some sort of like synergetic, you know, effects, I guess, when we're interacting with art, and I guess music is one of the maybe more.
I suppose it brings home that notion that there are professions of this. That in essence, Andrea is making the point that architects deliberately use space and relation in order to produce certain kinds of experiences, and I suppose artists do a similar kind of thing, that they deliberately like try to play with certain kinds of relations.
So it's like an embodiment, like you know, it's also interacting with bodies, but it's interacting with material bodies of different shapes, I guess. Yeah, in a way, yeah. So it's I guess it's a similar argument as to from an extended mind perspective. So you know, in as much as you can use I don't know, like the cane, the stick in order to kind of, you know, like find your way around, and it becomes, you know, part of your sense making system. Perhaps, you know, a building, the way it's like designed. I mean, of course, like that, I'm right away thinking of Eric Whitfield's architecture, like I don't know if you've seen it, but yeah, it can become an extension, I guess, of the self to some degree. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're coming to the end now. We should probably start to wrap up. I guess I won't shut everything down without a quick invitation to anyone who wants to make a very quick last minute comment, either via website or Adrian directly.
Adrian, now that you are there, oh my God, you look.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, good that you.
Yeah, but it was great. Yeah.
So thank you, Miriam, very much for your fascinating talk, and I've had some really rich discussions. I'm going to be pondering that one for quite some time. Some nice follow-ons from that. So we're very, very grateful for Miriam for kicking off this new season of Entails seminars, and we will look forward to more in the coming months. But in the meantime, we'll sign off. But thanks again, Miriam.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks to you. Thanks for listening, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Now.